Great. And so for today, I invite you all to listen deeply, embrace discomfort, and notice tension. If you do notice comfort and tension, ask yourself, why am I feeling this? Where is this rooted in? Don't be afraid to take care of yourself as those arise. It could be turning off your camera, getting a glass of water, really whatever you need. Take risks. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And hold each other with compassion. Social justice work is a practice. It's something that we are all working at daily, and mistakes might be made along the way. And so it's not to lean away from those mistakes, but rather to lean in and make the shifts that we need to create change. And on that note of holding each other with compassion, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this week in particular, unfortunately, like many weeks in the US, has been a particularly challenging one for those of us who really care about moving our work towards equity, justice, and transformation. And so I just want to thank you all for being here today, knowing the week we all had, and knowing that we all need to be change makers in our own little micro universes in order to make the world that we want. So thank you for committing to justice. Thank you for committing to power sharing, and thank you for committing to equity. And take care of yourself and take care of your community. So with that, let's check it to the next slide. All right, I'm really excited to welcome the amazing Melody and Terry. Melody has a history of work at the Social Justice Fund, the New Economy Coalition. She is a consultant and facilitator. Terry has 30 years of experience as a trainer and a facilitator on topics such as racism and oppression. Both of them are working to shift their clients and their communities policies, practices, and behavior to be rooted in social justice. And I'm just so excited to have them both here today. They are brilliant thinkers. They are going to ask us some challenging questions, but at the end of the day, it's really going to push us all forward in our work. I'm so excited to have them both here. And with that, I have the honor of throwing it right to Melody and Terry.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. We are so excited to be here. And so just a little bit about Terry and I, we do a lot of work together. We work with organizations, we work with groups, we do a lot of workplace culture and equity audits, providing workshops and trainings as well on issues of equity, racial equity in particular, and offer a lot of leaders and change makers coaching, consultation, and facilitation around their goals and their aspirations towards building a more just and a more liberated society. So check us out, workwithacorde.com. We are so glad to be here today and just give you a little taste of the kind of frameworks, the kinds of visions that we have for a more liberated future and definitely more liberated practice around philanthropy. Terry, did you? Yeah, thank you. So a little bit of agenda just to get us grounded. So welcome in today's flow. That's where we are now. We're going to talk a little bit about power, the structures of power, and about choice points. And we'll describe that word in a little bit. We use it a lot. Really, we're asking ourselves, who is at the center of your fundraising and grant making, and how do giving circles currently exercise power? Because we can't address power if we don't really think about how is it operating right now in the spaces that we inhabit. Then we'll work on a scenario that we've created for you all. We'll give you a taste of that. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but we're going to bring some applied practice into this space. And we'll go through some reflection questions. We'll have that as a tool for you to take home. So there is the scenario itself and a set of reflection questions. And we really encourage you to either do this on your own as someone who is a donor organizer, a person who's a philanthropist, a person who's giving, right, who's making contributions, or take it to your giving circle if you want to really have open up some conversations about power and values in your space. The continuum of power and influence, well, that's yet another tool that we've developed for this workshop. And it's a power mapping tool, and we'll introduce it along with some case studies so that you all can see kind of how we use the tool and see it see it in practice, really. And again, this is something that you can take back to your giving circle and really have some conversation and discuss, how might we shift power? What does power currently look like in our giving circle? And where are we on this continuum? And then we have a little bit of a call to action at the end, and then we'll say goodbye. So we're with you for a good 90 minutes, and we hope to be able to fit it all in and have some really great discussion get started here today. And like Kelsey said in the chat, we will have slides, the tools, all of that will be shared in a follow-up email after this session. So you'll have access to all of that.
Yeah.
Terry, did I miss anything?
No, that's awesome. Thank you all. And thanks for being here, Melody and Kelsey. Thanks for introducing us. I just wanted to add one other thing in the introduction, which is that and I think I speak for Melody too, we are also constant learners and practicers of everything that we're talking about. So we're not here because we've got it all figured out, but we are definitely sharing examples throughout this workshop of places where we've struggled through these exact kinds of decision points and struggled up against our own resistance to sharing power or our own need to organize with others to kind of reclaim that power in places where we're impacted. So we're right there with you, learning together as we go along. We want to start off our time with you by hearing a little bit about who's here. Kelsey's going to put a link in the chat to a Jamboard. And if you're not familiar with these, if you're having trouble, don't worry, we've got you. We've got some ways to help you participate, whether or not you have access to that right now. But basically what you're going to see are 3 questions. Some of them have a couple of slides, so kind of look for 3 different questions. Some of them will ask you to share your answer. Another one's going to ask you to grab a triangle, an icon, and kind of click on it and drag it to show a representation of where you are on that question. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and let you take a look at that.
Terry, would you like me to share the Jamboard as yes? Okay, I'm seeing a yes. Let me get that up.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
And if anybody's having trouble accessing that, you can chat to, see Kelsey's screen sharing now, so you can chat to me if you want, and I can help to get your comments updated.
And just in case anybody hasn't used Jamboard before, although many of you know, PHT, we're a very Jamboard heavy space. If you see somebody over this little with the little icon on the square, that's probably a post-it note that is claimed. So feel free to just click one and start writing. You can share your initials if you want. You don't have to. It can also be private. And just know there's a little bit of a word count limit. So if you see that your piece was getting cut off, it just means that it was a little wordy. So feel free to add. And then if you need help navigating across the Jamboard to answer the other questions, all you have to do is go right up to the top where the arrow is, and you can click through it. So if we're running out of space, there are more post-it notes on a second page. Here is where you can start moving your little triangles to where you think that you are on this decision-making process. And then we have that third slide at the back that talks about the ways that giving circles and or their members exercise power. And then Melody and Terry, you just cue me when you want me to stop my share. I love seeing these answers, y'all. What an expansive group.
Yeah, so we're seeing lots of things around issues, so housing, racial and ethnic wealth gap, gender justice, financial stability, children, families, a lot of things around community specific, folks that you're centered around, communities of color, queer folks, women, people experiencing homelessness, youth. So lots of people centering, lots of issues, lots of deep systemic shifts. And seeing a wide range on how close we are to the issues that we organize for. Just want to really acknowledge who's all in the space today. So a lot of folks who are currently impacted right now by the issues that you're organizing for, and or impacted in the past, right? Those are not obviously mutually exclusive, but they can be really different ways that we experience those issues. Also, when people close to you are directly impacted, that keeps it pretty close to the heart. And others of us maybe care for the issue, not directly impacted, right? So really different kind of lived experiences, really different sources of knowledge and care and closeness for that. Right. And so lots of folks not naming the where the money goes, right? Which is a big piece around giving circles exercise power, a very tangible and kind of mission-centered piece. And there are so many more, right? So kind of coming back to nominating with the organizations, you know, what grants are offered, what organizations are getting chosen, whose voices are elevated, right? The process of how this happens, that really, really matters. Criteria, funding guidelines, who and what is centered, right? Are we championing Black-led nonprofits, right? That's a definite choice and decision that that is made at some point in the process. And it goes all the way back to, I saw it here somewhere and I lost it again, but folks are naming also who's at those tables, right? Who is getting access to be part of the conversation. Take a quick look at that last one. Good. And folks can continue to offer notes in there. Melody, anything more you want to comment on here? Or let me know when you're ready to go to the slides again.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. It's nice to see who all is here based on some of these questions and the incredible work that people are organizing and fundraising around. It's amazing.
Yeah. All right.
And I'll throw it back to you, Terry.
Sounds good. I'm just looking for where Zoom has put my menu.
So I'm seeing actually on this last Jamboard here, a lot of the things that we've, that we're about to talk about, folks, that there's a lot of wisdom in the room already about how giving circles exercise power. Terry, let me know when you get that.
There we go.
Slide up.
Thanks.
Here we go. So it's actually, this is interesting. We pulled the components of a giving circle off the Philanthropy Together website to talk a little bit about those different points where power is exercised. So gathering the group of friends, family, coworkers, and our community members, right? Like we tend to congregate in, if we're doing a giving circle in community or with family or with friends or with coworkers, or we're inviting people into those spaces that we know, what we know just on the sociological level is that we tend to hang out, we tend to commune with people who are very much like us, and that is related to race and related to social economic status or class status, right? And that's by design. That's by design of how our laws in this country in particular have been shaped to keep communities segregated by race and class, right? It's part of our history. And so the people that we invite into the space, the people who might be interested in the space, the people who are in our communities tend to be people who have pretty similar backgrounds to us, right? And those things really start to take shape after we leave, in most people's cases, not all, after we leave high school, essentially, where if you've gone to a public school, chances are you're in a setting with people from a lot of different backgrounds, right? And then you start to really close in on who your community is, unless, of course, you went to private school, right? And then thinking about, so that question, it brings that choice point up, like who's at the table, who's allowed to be here, who's been invited to this space, who do we welcome into this space, who feels belonging in this space. And it also brings up this piece of discussion, right? Discuss the vision and values that motivate you to give and see commonality within your group. The values of a group will be shaped by who's in that room, right? So what conversations happen and how do they happen, right? How do they come up? Whose ideas are in that space, largely related to who is allowed to be in that space, who's invited into that space, who feels a sense of belonging and ability to speak up in that space, right? What values are present are largely related to, again, who's in the space, and what values get prioritized also have to do a lot with who's in that space, right? Or how they got there, or what purpose what function they serve, right? So thinking about boards that I've been on where they want a DEI voice, a diversity, equity, and inclusion voice, right? And it's like, we're prioritizing you being in this space because we want to hear you on this topic, right? So really, again, the values that get brought into that space are largely dependent on the people in the space. And then, of course, you're all familiar with this. It's why we're all here today. How you decide, right? How you, not just how you pull your funds and decide where to give based on your values, but do you have an application process? What does that look like, right? How accessible is that? How expansive is that? Do you, how do the organizations, if you don't have an application process, how do the organizations that get brought up in the space get brought up in this? Who gets to decide who gets funded, right? And how much, right? What the size of the grants are. What issues or what work is quote unquote worth funding, right? And even just thinking about how decisions are made. We often talk about decision making, but we don't talk about how we decide how to decide, right? So really thinking about the process. And then again, how much to give, what is considered quote unquote enough. And then once you give, right, how you measure that success, right? How you measure the impact of what you've done as a giving circle, if you're measuring that at all, if you have a metric for that. And then how you engage beyond your gift, right? Again, this comes down to who's in the space, what are the values in that space, who are the groups being funded, who gets to decide, and how we decide. So really a lot of, like, we can see how power infiltrates kind of every part of a giving circle. So whether it's the structure itself or any part of the processes throughout, power is embedded everywhere in the circle. So we can't just talk about power in the sense of, well, how do we decide how much to give and who to give it to? We've also got to talk about it at every single point, right? Where is power embedded in this process or in this piece of the structure? And how might we upend that to ensure that we're moving toward more liberated practice? So we're moving toward racial equity in particular, right? So when we name equity, we name what kind of equity. Are we talking about racial equity? Are we talking about gender equity? Are we talking about disability justice and disability equity? Are we talking about an intersectional approach to that, right? That centers race and considers all those other factors, right? So really important to really think about how power is embedded throughout the process, not just in our decisions at the end of the giving circle, at the end of a cycle. Even though we know that that is where a lot of that power is concentrated, but if we don't look at who's there and how they got there, right, and what we value and what we're discussing, then we can't really truly understand how much power is embedded in that decision-making process, right? Terry, do you have anything to add that I might have missed? No, okay. So for today, we're asking you all, just for today, let's assume that the best decisions are going to be made by the people who are closest to the impact. So what that means is whoever is closest to that impact, whether it's food insecurity, those people experiencing food insecurity are going to be closest, are going to be the best deciders for how to resolve or how to work towards food security, right, or food justice, right?
And keeping that equity analysis in there, like Melody said, nice and explicit. Our assumption also is that the most impacted folks are the folks that are impacted at the intersection of that particular issue and the impacts of systemic racism, anti-Blackness, those intersectional oppressions that you're really honing in on. So we're really getting explicit about not just anybody who's experiencing food security, but among that group, who is most impacted, right? It's going to be Black folks, it's going to be trans folks, folks with disabilities, and it's going to be Black trans folks with disabilities, right? And the closer we get into who's most impacted, the more likely we are to get to solutions that are actually going to work not only for that specific group, but also for our the whole community.
Thank you, Terry. And so, again, just for today, what if you were to let go of your decision-making power and offer it to the people who are closest to the impact, right? What would it actually look like to practice that, to say, hey, this is not my place. I know that this is not my role. What would it look like to cede that decision-making power to somebody else, right? And who and how do we identify who those people are, right? So there's a lot we won't get into here around the relational dynamics of being in community with people like Terry just named who may not be part of your giving circle, right? But we're going to try and think about what are the different ways where we might cede power at different levels to understand what it looks like to cede power to someone closer to that impact. It's why we ask that continuum question, right? In the Jamboard of how close are you to the impact of the issue that you were organized or fundraise around, because we want to see, there's different levels of being someone experiencing food insecurity right now. It's a very different experience than someone who just cares about the issue or has been impacted in the past and is okay now, right? So we might get very different decisions, very different responses, very different values and needs for priorities from people who are impacted in different ways.
That's great. I'm gonna transition in just a second to apply some of what Melody's been talking about. I just want to encourage you, whether you are on or off camera, to just take your eyes off the screen for a minute. Look at something far, far away. If you've got a window, look out a window. Take a breath, move your body, grab a snack. Continue.
Sorry, I'm realizing this is still me. I didn't realize that. Sorry, Terry. I was like, why did Terry mute? Technological difficulties and awkwardness always. All right, so let's work through this scenario. This is a gender justice giving circle. So I'll read this out loud. Your giving circle is primarily white women, most but not all of whom are straight and none of whom are Black. You have decided to, so there's that decision, right? We see a little bit of those decisions already. Who's there? You have decided to fund 3 groups at $100,000 each, so you've raised a lot of money. A member recently pointed out, without conscious intent, the organizations you funded in the past were primarily led by non-Black cisgender women and causes typically relevant to this group. So we're seeing a little bit of some of those past decisions where power was concentrated. You've got some applicants for these funds, including an organization supporting LGBTQ youth transitioning out of foster care, a fiscally sponsored activist group led by Black single parents with housing insecurity, a nonprofit supporting abortion access, and we use that term intentionally here to kind of delineate the kind of work that this group does. We're not using reproductive justice on purpose, which is a term typically used by people of color and trans folks doing reproductive justice work. And then a collective of sex workers organizing for the decriminalization of sex work. And then you've also got an individual community activist who has applied for a grant to support their gender affirming healthcare. So a note here is that your organization, your giving circle, has never given to an individual rather than an organization, but your group agreements would allow for it. So there's no barrier to giving to an individual, even though you've never done it. So our first question for you all, and this is I think, Terry, a point where we welcome people expressing themselves in the chat or coming off mute. What are the safe choices? And what are the quote unquote controversial choices? And we use that word, again, intentionally in quotes, because what's considered controversial has a lot to do with centering white comfort typically, and centering comfort in general, right? Where there's privilege being held, right? By the group. We don't want to make somebody uncomfortable. We don't want to make cisgender people uncomfortable. We don't want to make straight people uncomfortable. We want to make white people uncomfortable. So what are the safe choices among those applicants, and which are controversial, and why for your group? What is at stake?
Sorry.
What is at stake for your giving circle if you consider funding a controversial applicant? And in this case, maybe the individual is the controversial applicant, right? Funding an individual rather than a group. And then our second question is, what are some of the decisions that must be made in order to allocate those funds? So where's this next step in this conversation as we're talking about what it would mean to cede power, what it would mean to make these decisions around who to fund? And again, just take a second. The worksheet also
maybe we can take a couple minutes off camera, let folks kind of read that scenario. Is that what just popped into the chat? I think great. So you can take a look at it, process that yourself, and then we'll come back in 2 minutes.
Yes. So take about 2 minutes.
And it's okay if you don't get all the way through, that's fine. Get where you get, focus on what's useful to you.
Yes. All right. And let's hear from a few folks. Feel free, again, be brave. Come off mute if you'd like to participate, or we can do raised hands, or you can just pop some ideas you have in the chat. And I know we put up those 2 questions, but if you're looking at the worksheet and you feel really strongly you want to answer question 3 or question 4 or 5, we welcome that as well. You don't have to give us all your thoughts, just a thought. I see from Kelsey Tyler in the chat, who provides the grant money? Individual members or an existing endowed fund? Plays a role in the stakes. Yes. Yes. Legal and tax implications for giving. Nancy says legal and tax implications for giving to applicants who are not 501c3 orgs or fiscally sponsored 501c3. Yes, I'm so glad you caught that, Nancy. We put that in there on purpose, right? One of those decisions is around, does our group give to unincorporated organizations? What does that mean legally for our giving circle, right? Or for anyone who's tracking those donations, right? If they have to track them, like what might be a way to fund groups that are not incorporated, or individuals even. Great point. Anyone else? Yeah, potential loss of members who would not support issues like abortion. Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, so right, it's really thinking about who's in that group, what values are in the space. You've decided to fund gender justice, right? But again, that's very vague, and we did that intentionally. What does that mean to every individual in the group? How did they come into the space? What frameworks or knowledge did they have when they came into the space and they heard gender justice, right? Abortion access, Guinevere says abortion access could be controversial depending on what state you are in or geographically next to. Yes, again, really thinking about, what do people know about your group before they join that space and the values that your group already holds.
And on the flip side of that, abortion access might signal something different in communities of white, cis, straight women than it does in Black communities, trans communities, genderqueer communities.
Right.
So who are you trying to connect with and for what purpose?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Julia says, at stake, you may not be able to fund organizations you have recently or historically supported or have relationships with. Yep. Yep. So yeah, we don't know if any of these are repeat applicants, right? So that may be another issue, another decision that needs to be made. And Betty says, yeah, I need more information on most of the applicants. Yes, we often do need more than that, right? And the point of this exercise wasn't to get deep in the weeds, but to really identify what are those places where there needs to be more clarity, right? And if we don't have that clarity, how can we discuss power? How can we discuss, well, what's the right decision to make here? Or what's the most equitable decision to make here? What we do know is based on the previous cycles, right, that the group has funded many groups that are not like the ones who are applying this time around. And Colleen says, I'm initially curious if this group has any agreements in place around how they approach decision on funding organizations. If not, this creates an opportunity to have a bigger discussion and learning opportunities to create that framework. Yes, right. So this might be a place where you've gotten to this point and you might have to say, we got to slow down because we don't have a framework. We don't have shared analysis as to what creates change or what will be the most impactful, if that's something that, that is a way that you're talking about your grant making, and agreements as to what is gender justice? What would get us right? How is a housing group gender justice? How is a youth group gender justice, right? We may need to have questions to unpack some of those pieces. Sex work, right? We might have a question, how is that gender justice? Some people might have really strong feelings about how that is justice, right? And so really thinking about what are the conversations that need to be happening before we can actually make decisions, right? And another piece of that is, when should we have had those discussions before we asked for these applications, right? Yes, and this is Kaisen says, the circle may feel tension or unease around ceding power to an individual more so than an organization. Yes. Nonprofit organizations have traditionally represented trustworthiness. So yeah, we threw that one in there because it's one that a lot of progressive giving circles and giving projects are grappling with in an age of talking about mutual aid, right? Funding people rather than funding nonprofits, where money might just not be as impactful as it would be. Imagine funding an individual that might change that person's entire life, right? Entire course, versus funding a nonprofit, right? So lots of conversations coming up about what it means to fund an individual versus a nonprofit or an established organization.
I also love that framing, Kaisen, that nonprofit organizations have traditionally represented trustworthiness. And I think about the question, to whom? To whom have nonprofit organizations traditionally felt trustworthy, right? So that often has kind of a presumption of white folks, what traditional nonprofit structures have traditionally worked for me haven't always worked that well for Black communities, Black and brown communities, queer and trans communities.
So right, so even there, unpacking trustworthiness. What does that mean? Who do we view as trustworthy, and where does that come from for each of us, right? What biases are in place when you think about who's trustworthy?
And we've usually inherited quite a lot of systems and practices and norms whenever we join an organization or even create an organization based on existing norms and practices. And so sometimes it's an opportunity to kind of look at what are the agreements that we have in place, and are those serving us? Are those serving the goals that we have, the liberatory practices that we're trying to make? Or do we need to, as Melody said, kind of move back and revisit some of those questions?
I see another question here around, or another comment here around deciding the funding level before considering the applicant's ask, right? So the group has already decided to give 100,000, hasn't really considered each applicant's ask. Maybe that's underfunding or over. Well, I don't know if there's such thing as overfunding. Give people money, right? Like everybody needs money. So this idea of like, who decided how much and why? And then Emily has a really great comment here. How are our members interacting with the grantees? What cultural competencies would need to be internally increased to do no additional harm to the people seeking support, right? Yes, very, very, very good practice there. Good comment. Sarah says, exploring the sex worker space as an example allows people to challenge their biases and understanding, right? Absolutely, right? This is again, a very non-traditional group. So we got to start asking questions about, well, what's their access to funding is a question I already have, right? What is the access to that? What access does that individual or that group have to funding outside of our giving circle? And would our giving circle contribution be so much more meaningful because of their lack of access, right? Because of the kind of work that they're doing. And here Yvonne says, even when involving people closest to the impact, it's challenging to decide the relative value or importance of supporting an organization's. And I guess this is versus
organization A versus organization B.
Organization. Yes. Yeah. So it's always nuanced. It's always complicated. Right. It's always holding a few tensions at that moment.
Yeah, not the least of which is we don't want to get involved in oppression Olympics, right? We don't want to get involved in one person's life is more valuable than any other person's life. That's part of the paradox that we're holding, is that part's gross. And also we also don't want to take a colorblind approach to anything and pretend that oppression isn't having an impact, that there aren't differences in people's experiences, access to power, access to other funds like Melody was talking about.
And I really love this comment by Sharon here. I think I'll end here with the comments. These are all fantastic, but Sharon says, funding an individual can sometimes signal the beginning of systemic change in a family, which is just, I hear that and I'm like, yes, right? So and back to what Terry was saying, none of these are actually bad choices. We're hoping that, despite a frame of abortion access, whether or not that feels centered around justice enough, right? None of these are bad choices. And that's why we chose them. It's like, well, we can see the merits of funding this work under the scope of gender justice, under the value of gender justice. It's a question of, well, who gets to make those decisions, right? And what are the decisions that are in tension? What are the values that are in tension? What do we not know enough of yet? So these were excellent responses. You can see that we're in a really powerful group. And a lot of wisdom in this group. So Terry, if you'll go back to sharing the slides, just really quickly, again, we spoke to a few of the choice points. It's the next slide. A few of the choice points, again, who's at the table, right? Who's in that giving circle? Who sets the criteria for each decision, including how we make decisions, what format? Are we using good old-fashioned not good old-fashioned, but traditional Roberts rules, or are we using some other form of consensus-based decision-making or some other form of decision-making altogether? Who holds formal decision-making power? And then who holds influence, right? We ask those two questions side by side because sometimes we can have formal decision-making power, and sometimes what's written down on paper isn't what's actually happening in the room. We know that there's people who may carry more influence in a conversation. And then who evaluates your impact or the impact of your decision or the outcome, right? And we're always going to work on that assumption. If we're going to cede power, if we're going to shift power, if we're going to share power, the best decisions are made and the best outcomes are generated when those who are most impacted are closest to that power, right? Closest to that decision-making power. Being guided by the people who are closest to the issues will surface the best solutions, right, to an issue. And so we're going to keep working on that assumption because we hold that central to what it means to shift power, right, and to shift circumstances and to shift outcomes, which is what equity is about.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and you'll also hear us continuing to use that phrase choice points. And it kind of means, you know, if you might pick it up from context, but just to give a little attribution, as far as I know, that term comes from Terry Keller at Race Forward. And it's a way of thinking about those many moments in the work of your giving circle, in your everyday practice, in your everyday life, where you can go one way towards racial justice, or you could go another way away from racial justice towards racial harm. So it's just a really specific way of noticing where you hold power, right, in small and large ways. We are about to kind of shift and introduce the next tool. So I want to encourage you once again, if you haven't looked away from the screen for a while, to unglue your eyeballs, look at something far away if you can, move your body again, stretch, grab some water, breathe. And we're going to introduce some more frameworks. And again, you'll have access to these slides afterwards. So feel free to kind of take in what's meaningful for you right now, let go of it, let it kind of flow through you if it's not all showing up in your brain at the same time. So we want to introduce this tool, basic, kind of a simple power mapping tool. We're calling this a continuum of power and influence. And the idea is just to think about the power held by grant makers. So if you're a member of a giving circle, if you're involved in some of those decisions about who's getting money, where money is going, those kinds of decisions, there might be levels of power that are held by folks in that role. And then kind of on the bottom, you see kind of another continuum. Where is the power for the impacted community? So that might be at an individual level, an organization that's made up of impacted individuals. You might be thinking about it at the full community level. What's the impact? Who are the impacted community members? And so for any model of decision-making in a giving circle, there's going to be some level of power from 0 to full that's held by the grant makers, and some that's may be held by community. So let's show you a couple of first types of models, and then we're going to get into some specifics that can hopefully help this feel really recognizable. So in kind of some pure forms, I would say, I think the way we're thinking is like most giving circles, most grant making, traditionally, typically has been in power over kinds of models, where all of the power, all of the decision making and influence is held by the members of the giving circle, the folks who are giving out the grants, right? And they or we, if we're in those positions, we are making decisions for impacted communities, whether or not we ourselves individually are impacted. There's kind of a both and model, at least in theory, that is power with. And this is the idea that power and decision making may be shared in effective ways by grant makers and impacted communities. So really be thinking about what conditions need to be in place in this group and how they do business and who's at the table and who really has influence in order for power to really be fully shared by grant makers and folks from impacted communities. So we'll talk a little bit later about ways that sometimes this is the model in name, but in practice, in the impacts that are generated, power is really much more held by the grant makers and much less by community. So it's something to look out for. And then another kind of a pure form that's rarely seen in real life with giving circles, but it's power to or power within. So this is the idea. These are models where impacted communities or individuals hold all the decision-making power. So we'll talk a little bit later about kind of why that's difficult to fully realize in some of our practices.
And I do want to also add that there are some historical examples. There are probably some present day examples as well of what this looks like. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Oh, and there's lots and lots of space in here because there are lots and lots of ways that this might show up. So let's talk about a couple of specific examples. So kind of on this high power for grant makers, low power for impacted community is a lot of our typical designs, giving circle designs that you might have inherited or that you might be practicing if you haven't thought about it. I know this has been true for organizations that I've been part of. And this is where the giving circle decides who or what to fund, makes all the decisions, even though there may or may not be any impacted people in the group. So maybe not even having a mindful practice like Melody talked about earlier about how you're selecting members, who's invited to join, who comes to the table. You can also have the same space on this map is occupied by an organization that is in name a consensus process, but in reality, all the influence is held by non-impacted members. And we're going to talk about a case study that was kind of trending in this direction and what some of the shifts that they made to get closer to their actual intent. So something a little closer to the middle, so kind of some amount of shared power by both impacted community and grant makers, is where the grant maker might set some criteria or parameters, and then prospective grantees are invited to participate. Folks who are actually impacted community members or organizations, they make decisions within that container. So this might exist in different places on the map, depending on how much control the grant maker exerted over what those parameters are going to be. So the more space there is inside that container, the more power there is for impacted community to actually exercise power and authority. So this could move depending on that choice point. Here's kind of the ideal collaborative method. If you're really trying to share power, this is where you have consensus decision making by giving circle members, including some who are impacted and some trusted collaborators who are not impacted. So this isn't just anybody. This is where folks who are impacted figure out who can you be an effective collaborative co-conspiratorial relationship with, who can you have actual shared influence and power with, and then you can have a real true consensus process if you can kind of really work those dynamics within the group and really share power. Another model, and again we'll talk about this in one of the case studies, but high power for impacted community while still maintaining some power for the giving circle is when a giving circle cedes the decision-making authority to those of its members who actually are impacted. So you might have a giving circle that has folks who aren't impacted, and the folks who aren't impacted let go of some of that power and invite and acknowledge that the folks with lived experience are going to make the best decisions. So they're going to make those decisions and the rest of the group will support that. And then finally, again, this is one where it's often, there are some examples, but it's kind of more of a pure form where the giving circle might take the role of fundraiser only. So imagine that and kind of let yourself think about that. If you would be, what comes up if you're a giving circle member in imagining taking the role of fundraiser only. So in this case, all decisions about how to use the funds remain with the impacted person or organization or community. So that might require that you actually have relationships, some way of making this connection with that organization. And so, some of these things might be actually slightly more familiar if you've ever been part of essentially friend raising or mutual aid processes, where maybe there's somebody in your known circle who has a need for support, and that person is trusted. You're going to raise the money. That person is going to share, here's what I need the money for, and here's the amount of money that I need. And the friend circle just goes to work at trying to get those funds to that person or that group of people. So that's one example of that.
And
I don't have to go ahead.
Sorry, you were going to say, you can finish, Terry.
Oh, I was gonna say, I don't, the friend circle doesn't have to exercise any authority whatsoever over how that money is spent.
Mhm. I think a really great historical and present day example of this one is thinking outside of what we formally call a giving circle. So lots of civil rights organizing actually happened in this way. Highly impacted community, raising funds for the bus boycott, raising funds for marches, raising funds to get people to take time off of work or get childcare, or providing other resources like food, right? In order to allow for that organizing to happen, right? Or that fundraising to happen, right? So this is that is a concrete example of what high power for the impacted community, meaning everyone who's part of that circle of giving is an impacted party, right? Even if they're not close friends, right? They're an impacted party. We see that today in a lot of Black-led organizing spaces where fundraising is happening, where everyone in the room is impacted, closely impacted in some way. Either previously or in the moment, and is doing some sort of, again, mutual aid giving, some sort of, we're raising money for our community. So very, very common in particularly in Black giving circles and Black communities, and other communities of color as well. But that's where we see a lot of this. That's where we see a lot of this power within, right? What is the power that we wield as a group of people who are all impacted by this issue? Right?
Yeah. That's great. And I don't think I've ever heard this said out loud. I apologize, I'm going to probably mispronounce it, but just want to mention another example that we're aware of here in Oregon, where both of us sometimes live, and I'm currently located. The Chuush Fund that's a fundraiser. Great, thanks, Kelsey. Which is a fundraiser that's sponsored by Ceding Justice here in the Northwest. Where they have partnered with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, who has identified where they need funds allocated, and basically, and actually maybe we can just go ahead and put that quote, Kelsey, from into the chat. Basically, they have structured their memorandum of understanding, their MOU, for this fund in full partnership with the tribe as trust-based funding. So because the tribe is a sovereign nation and not a typical nonprofit grantee, we do not require reporting. Instead, we put our trust in the elected and appointed leadership of the tribe to do what they need to do to care for the health and welfare of their community with the investments of the Chuush Fund. While either party may end the agreement, we're committed to it remaining in place until the tribe tells us they don't want or need it any longer. So that's a place you can go and check that out as an example. Drop them some money if you'd like, and so that's one of those ones that would be mapped on that far edge of really trusting and entrusting the decision-making authority to the impacted group. All right, so you could probably think of a lot more examples, and in fact, what we'd like to do is just kind of take a screen break and a pause and invite you to think about some of these reflection questions for a couple of minutes. Number one, where would you place your giving circle or the organization that you organize or fundraise with onto this continuum? Where would you map your practice? Maybe not what you hope it would be, but if you were to talk about what outcomes are you actually managing to achieve, where would you map the amount of power held by grant makers and the amount of power ceded to impacted individuals and communities? Second, what, if anything, could you do differently that would increase the power and influence of impacted community and individuals? So this orange box is trying to pull us as far as we're willing to go to that far side of this map. And then notice, if you can, what comes up in yourself when you consider ceding that power. Is it excitement? Is it dread? Is it anxiety? What comes up? And how might you respond to those who advocate for those who are not impacted to retain power? And I just want to acknowledge, if you're anything like me, sometimes these messages come up first in our own brains, welcome or unwelcome. And so being able to notice those messages and figure out how we're going to interact with those, right? Sometimes we need to kind of look at our own thinking and give it a little hug, and then invite ourselves to kind of move away from it and see what more liberatory practice is available to us. So let's go ahead and take 2 minutes off screen. 3 minutes. Let's go ahead and take 3 minutes. You can kind of hopefully move your body a little bit and use these reflection questions however they're useful to you.
All right. I guess we'd love to hear from a few folks if you're willing to share. Again, you can come off mute or just drop it in the chat. See a great question from Kelsey in the chat. We hope that talking about our case studies will help address some of that question. But anyone want to share anywhere you'd see yourself on the continuum, or one thing you could shift to do differently, or how you might address what comes up for you thinking about ceding power or addressing other group members who may not be in that space with you. Again, feel free to chat. I see, yeah, Kelsey repeated Kaisen's comment. I look forward to showcasing this continuum to my Giving Circle members at our next meeting. So it's really helpful to have conversations on where we want to go. We would be mapped in the middle. I think we see ourselves further to the right, but in practice aren't as far. Yeah, we find that that's probably very common. Like Sarah says, what are the ways to seed and share power or share power? And we want to make a distinction between those things, because oftentimes we talk about sharing power because it makes us more comfortable, right? To be like, oh, we're sharing it, right? And there's an opportunity around ceding power. What does it look like to just give the power to somebody else, or let it be taken up by somebody else? What are the ways to do that without tokenizing and causing harm? And what are the opportunities to partner in community in a way that the unimpacted group deepens their understanding and support, while the impacted community remains the decision maker? Yeah, this is a big piece in what Kelsey said earlier in the chat around, like, how do we do that without putting more work on the impacted community, which is a fantastic question, right? And a question we should be asking, right? There can be like an abdication of responsibility that happens when we say, well, you decide, I'm just going to go sit over here, but you decide. And that's a lot of work, right? So what does it look like to do that well? So great. Any other thoughts, last thoughts, ideas? I want to make sure we give people space. Right. Well, if anything else comes up, feel free to share it in the chat. We love the use of the chat because we think this is a peer learning space. So if you've got questions that you're asking yourself or things you want to say, it's not just for the benefit of engaging with us as facilitators, but also sharing wisdom, sharing ideas with fellow Giving Circle organizers and participants. So again, this will be available. The slides and the worksheets will be available to you. And Emily says, my organization's donors insisted on shift and share instead of just shift. It was very revealing. I wonder what that means, shift and share. Emily, would you be willing to tell us more about that?
Sure. So we were developing our North Star for our organization. It was our equity committee. They've been learning about trust-based philanthropy and the importance of shifting power. But our equity committee, which are some of our most like forward-thinking members, they couldn't just say shift power. They said, well, I think it's more accurate and better if we say shift and share. They just weren't willing to go that extra step. They just couldn't let go. So I thought that was really interesting going through that process.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, again, it's that it feels more comfortable to say we've got to share, and we've all been conditioned into that, right? From a very young age, it's sharing is caring, and we've got to think about what does it look like. The Chosh Fund is like a really great example of that. What would it look like if that was shift and share versus we're giving full sovereignty to this indigenous tribe to decide how this is going to happen, right? And that is really powerful and really meaningful. Right, for both parties. All right, Terry, let's go into some case studies, and folks feel free to keep going into the chat. Oh, this is just a template, right, for folks, so you can use this as a blank slate for your Giving Circle. And again, we'll have these available to you. Oh, so Collective Power Fund. So case study number 1, we do have case studies, so you can, I won't read them verbatim, but we do have them. Kelsey, if you'd be willing to put the case studies in the chat. So I want to talk a little bit about Collective Power Fund. So Collective Power Fund is an organization, a small community foundation that funds organizations using collective power building methods to drive social change. So that's kind of the bread and butter. We use, if you're doing collective power building methods, organizations get to decide what that means to them to drive social change, then you could be funded by this community foundation. They facilitate giving circles throughout the year focused on relevant issue areas where members who are recruited just from the community, anyone can join, engage in political education, which is led by the fund's staff, and they learn how to become grassroots fundraisers. So they're fundraising from their networks and becoming grant makers in the process. Giving circles are typically mixed by race, gender, other social identities, and they typically engage in consensus-based decision-making processes to make grants to organizations that apply for funding. Now, in this particular case, we have the Gender Justice Giving Circle, which received 20 applications. They raised only enough money to make 14 grants. organizations that were working on LGBTQ and women's issues. And the group was made up of 6 people of color, 3 Black folks, and 12 white people. And the majority of the group was cisgender women, as is actually the case in a lot of giving circles. And the difference was that the majority of the Black people and people of color were non-binary, trans, or identified as LGBTQ, and all of them came from poor working class backgrounds. So there were some white people of that group that were also LGBTQ or coming from working class backgrounds, but that experience was mainly held with the Black people and people of color. So in this particular incident, the issue came up around, well, we haven't raised enough money to fund everyone we'd like to fund. We've only got 14 grants, and the queer, trans, and Black and people of color in the giving circle were really concerned that their consensus-based decision-making process was going to result in their voices being outnumbered or overshadowed by the rest of the group, in particular because some of the groups that were up for funding had controversial work, or what would be considered controversial, again, in the way that I spoke about it before. They were really excited about those groups because they believed these groups will get us closer to liberation, these groups will get us closer to justice. And they knew, well, the kind of work that they're doing, they're going to be disadvantaged. They're not going to be funded by the main funders that fund some of the other groups that were part of the application process. And so they were really thinking about, wow, our concern is the lack of awareness and lived experience of our giving circle, of our community of giving circle members here who are not people of color, who are not queer, trans, non-binary. They're not going to realize how important it is to fund these groups, and our voices and concerns may be overshadowed in the consensus process. So on paper, this group had a consensus-based decision-making process that included some impacted parties, right, and some trusted collaborators who were not impacted. They were all part of this process. They learned together, they raised money together, they were moving money together, right? And the concern of the people of color, of the queer and trans folks, was we're not going to get heard, where we know that our voices, based on just previous dynamics, are going to get overshadowed. In reality, we know that those non-impacted members were going to and would wield more influence over who gets funded. There were more of them in the room. Voices might be more comfortable sharing why they believe some groups should be funded and not others. And so it really resulted in consensus in name only, right? And that was the main concern. What the group ended up doing was that the impacted people, the people who were closer to the impacts, to what the giving circle was funding, so people who themselves were close to the oppressions faced by LGBTQ people of color, right? They said, they actually went up to the staff at CPF and said, hey, we'd like a more equitable process for decision making. What would it look like if the group decided to cede power to those giving circle members who were more impacted by the issues that we're addressing here, that we're looking to grant, right? What would it look like for that small subset of people to actually decide on allocating certain funds without the influence of other members of the giving circle, right? And in particular, they were looking at not just, can we decide 5 groups who get in with no other decision-making process, where white folks and cisgender and straight folks aren't going to decide, or we just get to decide who those 5 groups are and how much money, how much of the pot they get in their grants, right? So this was like pivotal for this group, because it had never been done before and had never been brought up. And of course, the people to bring it up weren't CPF staff, but really the participants in the giving circle saying, hey, this is what would look more equitable. If we're really about racial justice, if we're really about collective power building, this is how we do it. What was interesting, though, is that, of course, people of color, people impacted by an issue, are not a monolith, right? So they got into in their circle and they started to talk about who they should fund, these 5 groups that they wanted to fund just them. They could only they could only agree on 2 of them, right? And 2 of those really highly controversial, or groups that were considered controversial, right? They could only fund 2 of them. So what was interesting is when they couldn't decide on the remaining 3 groups, they actually went back to the consensus of the full group. So of the white folks, of the cisgender and straight folks, right? They said, how about these three groups and the remaining groups, we all decide together. So in that scenario, they actually pushed the power back into a shared space. And the difference—
please say your full name when you—
and the difference with this group was that now that a conversation had been had by the giving circle about, hey, we're afraid that our voices are not going to get heard, we would like to make some decisions. What actually happened in practice was that this group was now, the white folks, the cisgender folks, the straight folks in the group were so much more aware of the space that they were taking when it was coming to decision making and grant making. They were so much more aware of where they were on that scale, on this matrix of where power could be shared or where it's wielded, right? Or kept, right? So it was a really very interesting moment where that ceding of power actually generated to more equitable process, not just in those first initial decisions, but with the rest of the decisions that the giving circle was making, right? And Terry, we have a second example of a different way in which power was ceded.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just let that sit there. And again, the case study is there for all to look at and have conversations around.
All right. Mhm. And I'm seeing that question about ceding power versus shifting power. And I'll just say, for me, what that means is to cede power means I let go of claim to that power. I let go of the idea that I have a right to make this decision, that I'm needed in this decision. I still can be a consultant. If somebody wants or needs that, they can come and find that from me. But the decision, we are trusting the decision makers to make that decision and not standing and not holding ourselves in the way. All right, so our next example, completely hypothetical example, it comes to us from Martial Arts Dojo. It's not a typical giving circle. It's actually a nonprofit organization that teaches martial arts. And the board of the organization decided to take the donations that they received, and redistribute 30% of those donations to an organization that supports racial justice. This decision was going to be made by 7 board members, all of whom at this point in time were white. So there was a real recognition that the leadership was not in a position to hold lived experience of systemic racism and anti-Blackness, nor were most of the members, maybe any of the members at that time, holding lived experience around the issues that the group was looking to fund in the community. So folks shared a racial justice, set of racial justice values, but also with a few exceptions, folks also didn't really have a very advanced analysis of how to think about racial justice and giving circles and kind of some of the things that you all are pretty fluent, at least in the chat we're hearing, in thinking about and talking about some of these choice points. And so that capacity didn't live in this group as a whole either. So what we did, what this group did was to create a committee. So this hypothetical group. So this group created a committee, a board and membership committee, and decided to have that group be chaired by a leader who had a strong background in racial equity and facilitation. Got good participation from board members, from other students. The committee chair put together a set of proposed criteria for thinking about how funding might happen to begin to get really, really explicit about how racial equity was going to be, how the group was going to think about racial equity and racial justice and transformation. And as needed, there ended up being some coaching, some training along the way to kind of raise the capacity of the group to have those kinds of conversations and think about that. So there were conversations around, there was a criterion about the organization should be Black or Indigenous led. That was a choice point for the group that was proposed, but the group ended up having some uncertainty, some questions, some different analysis around what that meant. So it was kind of looking at community of color organizations that were led by Latine folks and people of color that might or might not have been Black and or Indigenous. And so really helping folks tease out and understand that. So the specific criteria that this group used are in there. They were Black or Indigenous led, centering Black and or Indigenous people and communities, and a few other things. There were some criteria that the group proposed that got rejected early on because of the ways that paternalism was showing up in what was kind of implied by those criteria. So for example, somebody talked about proven outcomes, proven to whom, proven by whom. The group began to talk about that and kind of unpack that a little bit and was able to set that criterion aside. And then kind of crucial here, and this is the next thing we'll just map on the power chart here, is that the group engaged a consultant who has lived experience and community relationships. And the group used this consultant to help, number one, hey, here's the criteria that they're thinking about using. Are they on track? Is there something missing? What could this group do differently to really center racial justice? And then here are the organizations that have come up so far. Are there any that are missing? Who's really out there doing this work? Who's trusted in community? Who needs the funds? Who's using them well? Who does the community see as the leaders to do this work? How can martial arts dojo remove themselves as much as possible from those decisions about what and who is worthy, and kind of trust what knowledge is there in the community already. So this kind of goes back. This is one way of answering the question that folks asked in the chat earlier. What about how do you not put too much labor on community, overtapped community to do these things? So this is a model in which this all-white group ended up engaging a consultant, doing a bunch of the labor ahead of that, and then engaging the consultant and putting minimal labor on them, but then also trusting what they had to offer, right? So the consultant kind of could take that place. It's not mapped. You can also see it's mapped kind of in the middle of power to the community, not at the far edge, right? So this is not one of the pure models that's really going to seed full power and decision making.
I just want to throw that when Terry uses the word consultant, not just someone as an advisor, but someone that was offered payment for that advising as well.
Yeah, very important, very important. And another piece that sometimes happens with consultants is they get consulted and then their advice gets ignored. And so what's really important in this case study and in all of our work is that if we're going to go to somebody and trust them to share their lived experience, their expertise, their analysis, we need to be applying that advice, right? So there's another opportunity for us to gatekeep by saying, oh, this advice that you gave me from your lived experience and expertise, this isn't enough, this isn't good enough, I know better, right? So we've got to watch out for that instinct. So this committee was able to kind of take that advice and work with that advice. The committee also did another step, which is kind of reaching out to each organization under consideration to see if that organization had any interest in kind of deeper relationship with the martial arts dojo. That didn't really show up as alive, probably in large part because there was no existing relationship between martial arts dojo and the organizations, right? So that's a piece that the group ended up kind of putting aside as a criterion. So in the end, the group invited some input from all the students, applied the advice of the consultant, and then took kind of a recommendation of the committee to the board. And they ended up deciding to donate their funds to Black and Beyond the Binary Collective. There's a link to that in the case study if you're interested in checking them out. But it's a group in the Portland area that builds the leadership, healing, and safety of Black, African, transgender, queer, non-binary, two-spirit, and intersex Oregonians. So again, what we're looking at, kind of like some of you in the chat, of kind of noticing kind of where are we now? how can we move ourselves? This model for Melody and me is about how can we move ourselves as far as possible towards centering the power in those most impacted, but also being really honest about what we can and can't do, what we are and aren't willing to do, press ourselves as far as we can, but not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good either. So this group was able to move this, donation of 30% of its donations. All right, we have just a couple of minutes and want to invite you to use this time in a way that's useful to you. So you might be wanted to take a look back at some of the material that has come out so far. You might have some questions as well. And we have a couple of minutes for that. So if you've got a question, you can come off mute or put it in the chat and I'll take a look at it.
Maybe we'll forward our slides, Terry, just so that we have
Yeah.
our info up at the end here. We want to thank you for your time. But yeah, we are happy to answer questions if you just want to reflect.
Oops.
Yeah.
And our contact information will be out there. If there are ways that Melody shared in the early part about some of the work that we do, if we can be of support to you. But we're going to go ahead and stop screen sharing here. So you can look at each other for the last little bit. Also encourage you to be thinking about what you want to take away from any of this. Some of you have already shared that, but what do you want to take and apply? We always say that training is as useful as what you do with it. So if you can think of some ways, small, medium, large ways that you could put something into action that you think can move you or your group toward more liberatory practice, towards outcomes that are more representative of racial justice and intersectional racial justice. I encourage you to think about that. You can pop it in the chat if you wish.
I think one thing I want to say about one of Kelsey's question before, Terry, which you partly answered around the how do we not overburden impacted communities, right? And it's also that question of discerning how close to the impact are we looking for, right? Like if we're funding issues around ending the experience of homelessness, right? Like maybe the solution there isn't to go to the person living outside on the street, outside of where your giving circle is meeting, right? Maybe that person is not who you want to tap for that labor, right? Even if it's compensated, right? Because it might be asking a lot, right? So how might you engage either, like Terry said, a consultant or a group of people or an organization that supports that community, works within that community? We have an organization in Portland called Street Roots. It's a newspaper, a community newspaper that's run by people experiencing homelessness or who have experienced homelessness, and sold by people experiencing homelessness or who are housing insecure, right? And so it's like, what does it look like to go into those, to build relationships with people in those spaces and say, how do we work with you to support people making these decisions? What does that look like? Do we allocate some of our funds to providing stipends or compensation for grant making decisions, right? So yeah, just thinking about how close to the impact is reasonable, right? In this situation.
Mm-hmm. You can also think about going where people are. So listen for where impacted folks in community are already saying what they need funds for, and go ahead and go with that.
Yes,
oh yeah, Street Roots is the name of the paper that exists in models of that exist in some other communities around the country.
Seattle has their own model of it as well. Again, they're paying the people with the experience to do that work, and it's in some cases job security, right? So.
All right, that seems like about our time for today. I know some folks are already needing to jump off, so go ahead and go when you need to go. Thank you for being here, and again, really encourage you to look for what's something that you could apply, what's something that you can take away.
Thank you, Melody and Terry. Thank you all who joined us today. I Loved this conversation, loved this session. Y'all clearly did too. Thank you all for your deep thoughts. I want to invite you all to continue to join us throughout the next few months. Our next session will be with the Grant Makers for Girls of Color and Black Girl Freedom Fund. Specifically, we will be exploring building power with Black girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth for just and liberated futures. I hope to see all of you there. And with that, we're going to start to close out our session. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, day, whatever your time zone may be. It was great seeing you all here today and in this fight for justice.